One of the challenges for leaders, particularly leading innovation and change, is the status quo is the competitor. Robert Cialdini, who was one of the early authors on persuasion, talked about this idea of reciprocity, that, if you do something for others, they feel a sense of obligation to return that favor. So if you involve others in shaping the solution, they feel like, oh yes, this is great. Now I've got to repay because this person is creating opportunities for us all, or they're solving problems that nobody has stepped up to solve yet.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we're diving into a fundamental skill for leaders, persuasion. Many think of persuasion as something only salespeople use, but in reality, it's one of the most essential skills for effective leadership. To help us explore this topic, I'm joined by Dr. Jay Conger, the Henry R. Kravis Chair of Leadership Studies at Claremont McKenna College, and author of, among other things, The Necessary Art of Persuasion, a Harvard Business Review classic. Dr. Conger, welcome to the Science of Leadership.
Thank you, Tom. Looking forward to our conversation today about a very important topic, persuasion and leadership.
Well, let's dive right into that. Dr. Conger, I think persuasion is often misunderstood. Certainly, a lot of us tend to think of persuasion as the type of thing that used car salesmen do. But how do you define it in the context of leadership?
So you're right, Tom, in the sense that the kind of popular notions of persuasion tend to be associated with used car salesmen and politicians. And we'll talk more about the distinction between kind of selling persuasion versus persuasion used in the pursuit of organizational change and innovation. I define persuasion in the role of leadership as a conversation that is designed to solve a problem that's a pressing problem, or an opportunity that's emerging that people want to capture. The conversation, though, is a little unusual because you bring to that conversation a strong point of view, but this is the catch, loosely held. And it's a bit of a paradox that somehow you get a strong point of view, but you're open to being moved, and you're open to other solutions, and you're open to other perspectives. And it's through this dialogue that actually you get to the outcome as a leader. So it's not the stereotype we have of the polished monologue where somebody's giving you a pitch. And even if you look at pitches by entrepreneurs or go to Shark Tank, you'll see there it's always a conversation, that you might have a really polished set of PowerPoint slides or something, but pretty quickly the audience is going to start asking you questions, and they're going to initiate a real dialogue about, well, what are you bringing to the table?
Well, I really appreciate that perspective, that it's a conversation. That really does change the concept and the construct, I think, when we begin to look at it as a conversation. Again, as you said, with some tenacity on one end, but then also the ability to be loosely held as well. That really is a great way to frame it.
It's a real paradox, but it's what works. Think of it as the strong point of view that you aggressively push. In 9 out of 10 cases, that's not going to work well.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost anti-persuasion, right? Because the more we try to convince people of something, probably the more aggressive we are in that way, the less likely they are to acquiesce to that, I guess.
Yeah, the only situations where you could pull that off is if you have tremendous authority and power, and you're literally pushing your initiative on the organization. Now, what's going to happen is they might feel they have to accept it and implement it, but their heart and their commitment, and I would argue more importantly, their willingness to send you feedback about what's going wrong is going to be dampened quite significantly. And so implementation of that change is either going to go badly or going to take a long time, because in their hearts, they haven't bought off, they haven't been persuaded by it. Mm-hmm. And so you're likely to see either passive resistance, passive dragging feet, or active resistance in some form or fashion. I'm often called in, I have 2 clients who I coach right now who were both sent to me because they tried to use I'm here to solve the problem for you, and I know more than you do, and here's what you need to do. So they used more of the monologue, assertive, I wouldn't even call it selling because it's really pushing. Mm-hmm. A lot of great constructive persuasion is more pulling than pushing.
With regard to that, at what point, because you were saying, some people come in with authority, power, so forth, and are pushing, at what point does it become coercion? Because a lot of what I was hearing is coercion, right? As opposed to persuading.
Yeah, I think the more the individual in the kind of a role of authority is not open to feedback, not open to a conversation about how's it going and what are your ideas about how to implement this more effectively, and it's just using pure either over the top enthusiasm, the kind of intense selling. This is the best thing since, sliced bread, or you have to do this. I'm the boss here, which would be more of the coercion. The more likely it's either going to take really long or it's not going to go well. And coercion can work in the short term, but in the long term, any kind of a coercive style of influence, what it does is it shuts down feedback to the person in the leadership role. Now you'll notice I'm not calling them a leader. They're just in a
I
role.
appreciate that. I really do appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'd make that demarcation all the time. I did this morning, actually.
Wonderful. You and I are very like-minded on this. People get into these positions of authority and we call them leaders, but they're actually not demonstrating leadership. So what it does is it shuts down kind of critical feedback. Bad news tends to come late. And then they're not utilizing the talents and insights of the people who actually have to make the changes and implement this initiative. So they've kind of turned their motivational switch off. So it can work in the short run, but long run, it tends to really backfire. And we've seen this throughout the history of both organizations and societies. And also, we live in a society which values points of view.
Mhm.
If you live in an authoritarian society, you probably have much more success with this authoritarian style of influence.
Yeah. Do you think the sort of Wall Street, which now is pervasive, but the quarter mindset, short term, make a profit, increase the stock share, so forth, may drive people to be more of that coercive mindset because it is just make a quick impact and move on versus having that longer mindset?
It's a really important question. And, we can only assume that there is some truth to it because we do see American corporations, I think at a higher rate, focusing on the short term and not necessarily producing long run success because of that quarterly earnings report that's becomes so important for investors. In other parts of the world, particularly in Asian parts of the world, you'll often hear people talking about the 10-year plan, the 20-year plan, where they are thinking 10 to 20 years out. They're not kind of responding, oh yeah, we got to get that quarterly earnings up. I think they kind of do intertwine. And you see often these change agents are brought into organizations with I know what we have to do here, listen up
Right.
and implement it. Again, sometimes if the group really doesn't know what they need to do, it can be really helpful. But oftentimes the people know what needs to be done because they themselves feel that many of the ideas they've offered upwards didn't get acted upon. And so sometimes the best leaders are really unleashing what people further down the organization already knows what needs to be done, but haven't been given the permission to do.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of complexity because it kind of depends on the industry, on the organization, what its culture is like. But I think generally speaking, there is a place, as you know, for urgency. And there
Mhm.
are people who do have a better sense of what to do. But generally speaking, the type of persuasion I'm talking about is really, really pivotal in leading any kind of change and innovation effort.
Yeah.
You want that engagement. And with the engagement, you're given the gift of trusting you, and you're given the gift ultimately of people giving you in the moment positive and critical feedback. And leaders who seal that off and just want to hear the good news in the long run set themselves up for some type of failure. And you've seen it throughout history.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I remember there's a wonderful story about Saddam Hussein, who literally, as the Americans are kind of on the ground headed to the palace, his generals are telling him that everything's fine, that we're good,
Right.
we're well armed and we're protected. They'll never get to the palace, and of course, they show up at the palace and out he goes.
Yeah.
And he kind of shut down all critical feedback.
Yeah. And then we see that a lot, and in some cases, increasingly in our society, it seems like. So, well, in the Necessary Art of Persuasion, you identified 4 essential steps in effective persuasion. Could you walk us through those?
Happy to. So the first one is really credibility. And credibility it's a funny beast in the sense that we always assume it's people looking at our track record or how expert we are. But you and I have both been not persuaded by experts. there's
Sure.
another there's another component that comes in, and that has to do with your personality and the relationship you build. So if you're incredibly egotistical, you're a big narcissist, or you're just not a nice human being, we're less open to being persuaded by you. You're not trustworthy or less open to being persuaded by you. So there's this relationship dimension that gives you credibility that people underestimate how important it is. And then in the moment when you're persuading, we're paying attention to the tone of your voice. We're watching your body language. Are you conveying a sense of confidence and conviction, but not too much? we have a little radar about, wow, that's a little bit too much enthusiasm. They're a car salesman. They're hyping this up. And I don't trust that much hype in this situation. On the other hand, if you're using a lot of perhaps maybe qualifying words, we're starting to worry that you don't really think this is the best way to go. So there's this kind of real wonderful sweet spot in terms of body language and voice tone. And it's really fun to watch. I like Shark Tank because it's a great place to study persuasion. And some of the entrepreneurs who do the best are, I always say, humble, but confident. It's this kind of lovely blend of the two. Again, it's a paradox, but it goes super well. So credibility, what I find is that most people overestimate their credibility with their audience. They actually don't have as much as they think they have. And so they go in too confident. The second dimension is called framing for common ground. Literally in the first few minutes when you're sharing what you're hoping people will support or the request you're making, they're listening very carefully to see, is this person, Tom, who's advocating this point of view, does it connect to my world? Do we have common ground? I mean, is this going to benefit? It doesn't directly have to benefit me, but it has to benefit the team or the customer or the organization or society. And we're making that judgment in a minute or two. And if we say, no, this is kind of a self-serving request, I'm not going to buy off of it. Now we slip into selling. And so I say to myself, wow, he's doing this for himself. So I'm going to ask for something in return. Now we're going to move into negotiations. And a lot of persuasion has to employ negotiation, but we don't want to go there too quickly. So once you establish common ground, how my issue is actually your issue, and it's an issue you need to be thinking about deeply and have as a priority. Now I slip into what's really the core of persuasion, which is my arguments. So I call that the third C, compelling arguments. If you look casually at managers and even executives in meetings, they tend not to argue well. It's really a paradox because we've all watched these courtroom dramas in movies and episodes. An argument is a claim you're making, but it usually needs evidence to prove the claim. So you can think about each argument, and I'll go back to kind of the stereotype. My client is innocent. They did not murder their wife. So that's the claim. And the evidence is he was at his men's book club in the 3 hours in which the murder occurred. And so that's the evidence to support. Now, in the world of business and government and not-for-profits, we're often using data to prove our, but there are many forms of evidence. So you have to argue well with compelling evidence. And evidence then becomes another source of your credibility. What it usually happens is people haven't thought through their arguments well. They've kind of prepared up here in their head. They haven't sat down and worked with a colleague thinking through. And so they offer them very casually in the meeting, and they may or may not have enough evidence. But if you've done a great job, you got up to 3 arguments. I always say try to keep it at 3 or below, because the audience can't track more than 3 arguments. And have your evidence be very compelling, a blend, if it can be, of data, rich examples, potentially personal testimony. And then if you can connect it to the individuals who you're persuading and their lives, that's very powerful. And then the final dimension is called connection, which is really the ability to do a couple things. One, create a compelling narrative of why we're looking at this issue, why it's a priority, and there has to be some urgency, and how are we going to solve it? And that narrative sets the stage, and it does an emotional connection with the audience. And then in that narrative, a great narrative speaks to what the people in the room truly value, what's really meaningful to them. And that then gets you the emotional commitment. So you can think about the front end of persuasion is the credibility and the common ground. That's just getting their attention and interest. And then the compelling arguments is moving their mind to say, yes, she's right. We need to do this. And then the connection is creating emotional energy so they go out and implement it. You and I have all been in meetings where people nod their head in agreement. Somebody proposes an idea. Oh yeah, great idea. But nothing happens. Nothing. And that's either due to a lack of good arguments and evidence and or a lack of connection.
Those are really excellent. I appreciate that they are all 4 C's. I have a 4C model of my own for leadership that I talk about on this show a lot. And so that's good. Credibility, common ground, compelling arguments, and connection. I was wondering, as you're going through those, because there are some people that we can identify who may not have some of those, but somehow, right, they're able to persuade people. They may have limited credibility. You don't trust them. They've done things that are clearly not good, but yet somehow they're able to connect, maybe, or something. So it made me just wonder as you were going through, and maybe it's contextual. Is there one that is more important than the others, or is it just sort of situational?
So there are individuals who have what we would call charisma. And they have a lot of charisma. Now, by the way, charisma is always in the eyes of the beholder. So they might be charismatic to one audience, but not charismatic to another audience. And charisma really is this idea of connection. It's that final C. And they're able to connect to their audience members through a really powerful emotional connection. And what I've learned is that comes in one of two forms. The first form is kind of an enthusiastic energy, which is often tied in the business world to building something new and then potentially to investors' greed. Oh, wow, we can change an industry. That's the aspiration. And we can make a lot of money. This is fantastic. I want to follow that charismatic leader. And so we have a long history of those characters throughout, literally. And we might have called them snake oil salespeople. And then the better ones changed industries like Stephen Jobs. And they had long on vision and charisma and got everybody excited. And what makes them really interesting, Tom, is the fact that, when Jobs is starting out, nobody knows whether this little box is going to be anything. And it doesn't really have any memory. It's kind of, I remember my first personal computer, I could like store 100 pages of text or 200. That was it. And I remember people saying, oh, it's great for recipes. You have a little thing on your kitchen counter to store recipes.
Yeah.
And then the other side is anger and fear,
Mhm.
where they use their charisma to connect to people through anger and fear, and they leverage that. That final C is very important, and it has a shadow or dark side. And I think that's why sometimes individuals can mobilize people through just the charisma they have.
Yeah.
I always like to say, what's that charisma in the pursuit of? Is it in the pursuit of betterment, improving people's potential, improving a society's potential, or is it in the pursuit of kind of self-aggrandizement and things like that?
Yeah. You mentioned Steve Jobs. Do you have another real world example you could point to say, wow, that person really was effective at persuasion?
Yeah, I mean, one from my original research on Change Agent, who I always think of because she just was really an exceptional and thoughtful persuader. So she was a senior person in an advertising agency in Canada. I knew her pretty well, and her name was Monica Ruffo. And Monica was in charge of the Canadian account for one of the largest fast food companies in the world. And in the United States, this fast food company had launched the value meal, which today we know well, where you get the fries, the milkshake, or the Coke
Yeah.
and the burger as a package for one price. Canada had not implemented that. And the US, which is where the headquarters was, went to Monica and said, we need you to persuade the Canadian franchisees to move to this value meal because we know that we can see some of our peers in Canada are launching it. And we have to at least be at the starting line with them because otherwise we will fall behind competitively. So Monica understood that framing was the wrong frame for the Canadians. Because if you looked at the fast food franchisees in Canada, they were doing fine. They were whatever value meals were appearing across the country, they had not been impacted by. Their number one concern was profitability. And at the time, their stores, almost to a few exceptions, were incredibly profitable. So she went back to the drawing board and she said, look, she told the headquarters, this competitive framing is not going to work in Canada. The number one concern for our franchisees is profitability. So I'm going to use a different way to persuade them. And what she did is there was an annual meeting where they all came together, I believe in Toronto. So she got a couple hundred franchisees in the room. And she begins by saying, we're going to talk about enhancing your profitability. And we're going to do it through something called the value meal that you're now becoming very aware of. And let me walk you through why value meals are much more profitable to you than the current single item sales. And she talked about how when you have a value meal, the soft drinks and French fries grow pretty significantly. Well, guess which items on the menu are your highest profitability item?
Yeah. Sodas, absolutely, yeah.
Fries. You make far less money on that burger. She then talked about what had happened in the US, which is that all the people who had adopted these value meals saw increased profitability on their bottom line. She then talked about the fact that a Harvard Business Review article had shown that when customers perceive greater value in what they purchase from a company, sales go up. So she brought in this research. And then she closed the meeting with a letter that had been written by the founder. And it's kind of a beautiful letter. It, is maybe 40 years old or 30 years old, in which he talks about the most important asset in the company was the franchisees, and that our whole mission as a company is to serve you. So at the end of this, 15-minute, 20-minute persuasive speech, they got to vote. 100% accepted the value meal.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
she did a really beautiful job of kind of reframing. She understood her constituents well. She knew what was the most important thing. She built a set of really simple but clear arguments with great evidence that moved them. And then she connected through that letter in which the founder really felt that the heart of the organization was the very people, who were in that room. It was interesting because it wasn't the customer, it was the franchisees, because the founder felt they determined the quality of experience for the customer.
Yeah. Well, I'm not in the fast food industry, and I was ready to vote yes for. So that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome. It was really wonderful.
What about the ways that we mess this up? I know that you've previously also identified 4 ways that we fail with persuasion. Can you expound on those a bit?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I'll go into the 4, but I would say the number one way is a lack of good preparation.
Hmm.
When I run seminars on this topic all year long, and I ask people to bring an issue they're working on, and what I see over and over and over again is how poorly prepared they are, how they have not engaged their colleagues in kind of thinking through the issues, how often they have a pretty good argument, but they haven't thought about compelling evidence. So that's number one. Just getting excited about an idea and trying to champion it like that, sorry, it's not going to go very far. This second one, which I mentioned in the article, is the hard sell. I always like to say, come on strong, go out quick. Generally speaking, you and I are wired to distrust a hard sell. And that's kind of like the used car sales person who we go, wow, this is a bit much. They're really pushing too hard on me. So I always say the hard sell doesn't work, generally speaking. Not being open to compromise in any major change and innovation effort involving persuasion, you have to make movement. You have to change your position. You have to play with the solution. You have to invite other people's ideas in, because generally speaking, you have not thought of all the different issues that initiative is going to run into. So if you fight back on compromising, you've already begun to undermine your persuasion. I had one of my favorite change agents. He used to say to me, he said, hey, look, I'd rather have 50% of my idea than nothing. Because he said, if you go for 100%, you're likely to get nothing.
Yeah.
And then
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And again, in persuasion, you're getting your colleagues to, they often have to implement it. So they want to own it. They want to own part of that solution. Over-reliance on just great arguments. And we go back to the fact you've got to have credibility. You've got to have framed the arguments well. And then you have to have that emotional and relational connection. So if you've just got that 1C, compelling arguments, it's not enough. And then the final one is that somehow it's this very finely tuned monologue that you deliver in a meeting. You put weeks into preparing the slides, and then you stand up and you make your case. In every major change initiative or innovation initiative, it's a long process. And there might be one meeting where there's a gatekeeping event where we say proceed or don't proceed. But even that will have more gatekeeping events, which is, do we commit more to this or do we back out of this? So not failure to understand it's a process is the other one.
Thanks for sharing those. This has been really great so far, just to walk through those, to understand them. I was wondering if you could, and you've hit on this a little bit, but from your perspective, why is persuasion more powerful as a tool than, for those of us in leadership positions who fancy ourselves to be leaders, a more powerful tool than simply issuing directives?
Because people willingly commit to making it happen. And I think when you have freedom of choice, you're more motivated, you're often more excited. So I think that willingness, that's the beauty of great persuasion. You don't push people into something. They want to step in.
Yeah.
With you, they want to make it happen. So
yeah, I mean, it's almost like it's not persuasion, right? It's almost like it's their idea in a sense.
And that's why, Tom, to your point, they have to shape part of the persuasion. And that's why the monologue or the coming on with a hard sell doesn't usually work, because you're needing to be the hero. And that there might be a few times where that's okay, but most of the time, as you and I know, in organizations, that's not going to work well.
Well, and as you were saying, this colleague who said he'd rather have 50% than zero, the idea that, and this gets to some degree to some of the science and the literature on these things, but that if we bring other people in, they bring an armamentarium of creativity and insight and energy, and just like you were saying about Saddam Hussein, was that you don't get those inputs, but if you bring everybody in, they're going to give you all these inputs, and it's going to increase, most likely, the viability, the success of whatever it is that you're trying to do. That's been shown pretty substantially, I think, in the literature.
Yeah, Robert Cialdini, who was one of the early authors on persuasion, talked about this idea of reciprocity. That if you do something for others, they feel a sense of obligation to return that favor. So if you involve others in shaping the solution, they feel like, oh yes, this is great. Now I've got to repay because this person is creating opportunities for us all, or they're solving problems that nobody has stepped up to solve yet, solving problems that will help me in what I need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we lose so much when we don't capitalize on those talents and those insights of the people.
Yeah, I've always said it's a bit of a paradox because I think to be a truly effective leader, I mentioned earlier, you have to have this kind of strange blend of humility, but
Yeah.
confidence.
Yeah.
And again, it's like a strong point of view, loosely held. Like, well, how do I do that? Well, you and I have met, and I sense you're one of them, a person who has a humility that keeps them grounded, but also a sense of, hey, we need to do this. This is really important. And so, on the persuasion side, if you think about it, the confidence is the strong point of view. The humility is the loosely held. You realize you don't have all the answers, and you realize in the journey of change, there are going to be all sorts of surprises that you don't know what to do. And so the engagement becomes absolutely pivotal to success.
Yeah. When with regard to, loosely held, General Jim Mattis likes to say, listen with a willingness to be persuaded. And so it's that, that component of it anyway. So
It's really true.
As I was thinking about our conversation today and thinking about people that I would say I think were really good, or historic figures, Winston Churchill came to my mind. I'd like to get your thoughts on him, but I think, he was able to convince the people of England in somewhat questionable circumstances, right, that they could survive and beat the Germans. I mean, everything's blowing up all around them and they're on an island sort of isolated and all of Europe's falling that, and nobody else thought that could happen, including the English. But he was able to persuade those people in that. And that, I think that was instrumental, not only in the survival of England, but probably in the survival of Europe as we know it. Anyway, I was wondering what your thoughts were on Churchill or others.
Well, I think Churchill is a great example of somebody who really reminds us of the power of words. Words can be very engaging. They can stir up emotions. I always like to say, my wife can be 1,000 miles away from me, and I'm on a FaceTime call, and I can use these 3 words, I love you. And she and I will both have an emotional reaction. Now, it's an abstraction in some ways. It's just 3 words, but words carry emotional content. And Churchill is a great example of somebody who understood that and then was able to take these abstractions, these concepts, and really put them in a way that connected to, in this case, the survival of a nation, but also their resilience. I've always felt we're spendthrifts with words. We're like, whoa, we don't treat any of them as precious. But
Yeah.
when they are done, when they are well thought out, and they convey, I think, often a genuine emotional connection that we have to those words, they can move people, they can move mountains, they can build societies. I like to say that everything that you and I enjoy in life, from that microphone to the headphones, to the homes we sit in, to the cars we drive, that was somebody's idea. But they had to get other people convinced and persuaded that that was an idea worth making.
Yeah.
And they were persuasive. They got them engaged. And so all the wonderful things that you and I enjoy are the product, usually, not always, but usually of an individual who had an idea and then got others engaged around it in a meaningful way. And they created that. There are a few exceptions, like the pharaohs, who said, I need a big tomb. I need a spaceship to get me to the afterlife. So, because I'm the boss here, I'm going to give you some bread and I might give you a home, but you got to work on that big pyramid for me. So there are moments where it wasn't persuasion; it was just pure authority. But in today's world, much of what happens is through the energy of words, people getting excited, or in Churchill's case, helping us understand that we can resist in a way that will allow us to survive. FDR was another good example. Lincoln, the power of the word. Those are all remarkable persuaders. You pray they come along with great frequency.
Yeah. Seems like not as frequent as we like sometimes. So
yeah, it feels like every third decade or something. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, shifting gears, thinking about sort of the practical components of this idea of persuasion. what would you say are the actionable steps that leaders can take today to improve their persuasive abilities?
So I think, first of all, when you have a perspective on an issue, or you've got an idea that you'd like to put into practice, or you need money to kind of fund an idea, the first thing you do is you sit down and you say to yourself, well, who should I involve? Who should I reach out to? Who's going to have to either decide to support this or actually have to implement it? And then go to each of those individuals and be curious and say, do you see this as a problem? Or is this an opportunity that you think we should try to get? And watch what they tell you. And they might tell you that now is not the time, that not enough people feel the problem, or there are other more pressing problems. So that would tell you to hold off. But if you pick up a sense, oh my gosh, yeah, that's a really critical issue, then you deep dive with them and say, well, how would you approach this? And who would support us and who wouldn't? And I have an idea. What do you think of this? And what if we were put our ideas together? What would it look like? What we need to argue and what kind of evidence would be compelling from the standpoint of the individuals. So I think in many ways you begin to test the viability of your idea and the viability of the moment. Is this a receptive moment? Because one of the challenges for leaders, particularly leading innovation and change, is the status quo is the competitor.
Wow, that's a good idea.
So you're vying against the status quo, and the status quo is probably the most important competitor, but the second most is other colleagues are competing for those limited resources that you're going to need. So right behind the status quo are all these people who see a limited set of resources that they want. And you might be taking some of for your initiative. And then behind that is most change in innovation means loss for some part of the organization or the society. And oftentimes the loss is among the most powerful. And so you have to think really carefully about, how do I get the individuals who will experience loss on board, given that the last thing humans want is to lose something. So I'm working with a change agent right now, and she's got 4 key stakeholders who each control kind of an operating silo in the organization. And she wants to create a unified platform where they all share the same services. But you can imagine each of them likes the fact they control those services.
Right. Fiefdoms.
Yeah. So she's doing a really good job kind of helping them understand the net benefits of the shared platform versus the divvied up platform. But she's really had to ask them a lot of questions, think a lot about who they are, think a lot about what they need, and what they'd be willing to give up for what they want, or what efficiencies they'd get. So I always say, what I see generally in terms of why people don't succeed is they don't do a lot of field testing. And it's in that field testing that you start to build support. You also start to shift in terms of what you realize is needed. And that allows you to create a solution that more people buy into. It also helps you understand whether timing is right or not. Oftentimes, ideas, innovations are either too early, or the change agent has failed to build the case for urgency.
Those are really great practical steps. Thanks for sharing those. And I really appreciate your articulation of things. It's clear to me that you're a tremendous expert in this domain, and just your ability to articulate it clearly, concisely, in a way that is portable. I'd like to do that with ideas that I develop and try to teach other people. And that's one thing that I really try to do on this podcast, is try to give people that something that tangible they can carry away. And so you're masterful at that, Dr. Conger.
Well, thank you. I was very fortunate. Unlike a lot of academics, I was a line manager for quite a number of years. So I had to implement things where I had to be able to translate them really well and clearly and concisely. And then I think when you become a teacher, what you have to be able to do is translate the complex in ways that aren't too simple, but people really can grasp. And so I feel like that's, whatever reason, a talent that I've had to develop over the years. And then when you teach persuasion, oh my gosh, you have to be able to do it.
Yeah.
In some ways, I have to be a model for what I'm doing, and by the way, I'm using all of these practices. And so, I have to show I'm credible. I have to show that I can connect all those things.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it probably highlights one other quality that you just made me think of, which is curiosity and listening. I think to be effective in persuasion, you have to be very curious about the people who you're engaging and their situation. So you have to have a good listening skill. And you can't have what we call, leading questions. Hey, Tom, don't you think that's really the best solution? Mine?
Yeah.
You can't do that kind of approach and succeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I have some people in my family that's their approach,
And parents often do that with their kids.
Right.
Don't you think you should make your bed right now?
Surely you wouldn't want to do X, right?
Right. You don't want to mess up your school, your grades. Wouldn't it be good to be doing your homework right now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are not persuasion.
Right. Well, as I was thinking about, and you mentioned his name earlier, but I was thinking about this and practical steps and tips and things like that we could offer. I was reminded of Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, which for listeners, it's a fairly thick book, but I will tell you, it is a really, really well done book, and I certainly recommend it. But in it, he identified 6 principles of persuasion. One of them you hit on already was reciprocity. So we offer value to people first, then they're more inclined to reciprocate that. The second one was commitment. So when people commit to something publicly, they're more likely to follow through. If you tell people, I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to do an exercise program or whatever, you're more likely to actually follow through on that, as opposed to if you just keep it to yourself. The third one was social proof. So when leaders highlight examples of peers successfully adopting a new initiative, it increases likelihood of others. You mentioned of others to actually follow suit. You mentioned Monica Ruffo and this idea with regards to the Canadian franchisees. She offered social proof in the fact, hey, this is working really well in the United States. So that was an example of that. The fourth was authority. People are more likely to be influenced by those they perceive as credible, which is one of your C's. And liking, and that gets to charisma a bit. We are more likely to be influenced by those we like. We increase our persuasive ability by building genuine relationships, showing empathy, and finding common ground, which is one of your C's. And then scarcity is the last one. So if something is perceived as limited or exclusive, the value increases. So when we can show the scarcity of something, whether it's an opportunity or whatever it may be, people are more likely to be involved or want to be involved. So those are Robert Cialdini's 6 principles of persuasion.
Yeah, and they're very, he captures many of the core dimensions, kind of the fundamentals.
Yeah. He also, just for listeners, has another book that's more recent. It's the last couple of years. I just read it probably within the last 6 months, called Pre-suasion, A Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade. I think that's a really good one too, if you want to be out there and want to listen. So, well, Dr. Conger, before we end our conversation, you've worked with many top executives. What's one thing the best persuaders all have in common?
I would say that they're always thinking about their audience. They're always thinking about where are they at on this issue. So that sets them up for a conversation. They're not egocentric to the point where they think, I have the answer, they do not. And
Brilliant.
It's an idea of together, leadership is a shared activity. And that leads them to it being a conversation versus a monologue.
That covers so much ground, that statement. Think about your audience. That whether it's persuasion in general, whether it's communication, whatever it may be, that's absolutely critical to so much of what we try to do in leadership. Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's a great way to wrap up our conversation today. Thank you, sir, for joining me on The Science of Leadership.
Tom, it's a real pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to actually listening to your podcasts in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.